The alien princess's desperate situation. In the vast reaches of space, a war raged between the alien empire of Voria and a ruthless enemy force known as the Xantor. The Xantor were a terrifying race, unmatched in their military strength and brutality. Their ships blotted out the stars, and their soldiers showed no mercy, leaving a path of destruction wherever they went. Princess Velara of the Voria Empire stood on the balcony of her palace, gazing out at the battlefield below. The once beautiful land of her people was now scared by the conflict. Fields that had once bloomed with alien flowers were now barren, the sky filled with the smoke of burning cities. Her empire, once powerful and proud, was crumbling under the weight of the Xantor's attacks. Velara had always been a strong and determined leader. She had inherited the throne after her father's untimely death and had fought tirelessly to protect her people. But now she felt defeated. The Xantor had broken through her defenses, and their forces were closing in on the capital. The walls of her palace were no longer secure. Even her own advisors and generals had started to speak of surrender. Her mind raced. What could she do? She could not allow her people to be wiped out. She could not let the Xantor conquer her world and enslave her people. Yet every time she looked out across the battlefield, she saw no hope. The Xantor were too powerful. They had advanced technology, weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single blast, and armies that seemed to never end. Her advisors had already begun making arrangements for her to escape. They spoke of hiding her away in a distant part of the galaxy, where she might be safe, but she couldn't bear the thought of abandoning her people. Her duty was to them, not to herself. The alien princess walked slowly back into the war room. The faces of her generals were grim, their eyes filled with worry. They had all fought valiantly, but their forces were dwindling. The enemy was relentless. "Your Highness," one of her trusted generals, Commander Theron, said as she entered, "we've lost contact with the Eastern Battalion. They've been overrun. The Xantor will reach the capital within hours." Velara stood tall, her heart heavy with the weight of her responsibility. "Then we fight. We will not surrender." The general hesitated. "The enemy is too strong. If we continue, we risk the destruction of what remains of our people." Velara's eyes narrowed. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that if they fought, many would die. Her people, the Vorians, were brave, but they were outmatched. The princess moved toward a large map of the empire displayed on the wall, her fingers brushing over the glowing surface. "There must be something we can do, a way to defeat them, something we haven't thought of yet." She was lost in thought when a new voice interrupted her. It was the voice of a young human, a student from Earth who had arrived as part of an exchange program just before the war had begun. He was not a soldier, not even a trained fighter. In fact, he was a simple student, only 18 years old. His name was Daniel. "I might have an idea," Daniel said, stepping into the room, his voice surprisingly steady despite the gravity of the situation. He had been studying the culture and history of the Vorians, but his knowledge of their enemy was limited. He had spent most of his time at the palace, far from the front lines. But even so, his voice carried an air of confidence that caught Velara off guard. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the young human, who had barely begun to understand the complexities of the war they were fighting. How could someone like him possibly have an answer to the disaster that was unfolding? "Speak," Velara said, her voice sharp, though she did not mean to sound dismissive. Perhaps this young man, with his outside perspective, could see something that she couldn't. Daniel stepped forward, his hands slightly shaking. "The Xantor have an overwhelming advantage in sheer numbers and firepower, yes. But their technology, it's not invincible. I've studied their systems, and I've noticed a weakness in their power grid. If we can strike there, we might have a chance." The princess studied him closely. Could he be right? Could a student like Daniel know something that her seasoned generals hadn't? She felt a flicker of hope, but it was small, fragile, and easily crushed by the weight of her own doubts. "Tell me more," Velara urged, her voice softer now. Daniel explained his plan, his words flowing quickly as he described the Xander's technology in detail. It was risky, highly risky, but it might just work. If they could disable the Xander's central power system, it could disable their entire fleet. The Xantor would be left vulnerable, unable to fight back. Villara listened intently, her mind racing. It was a desperate move, and there was no guarantee it would work, but it was the only option she had left. If she surrendered, it would be the end of everything. If she followed Daniel's plan, they might just have a chance. She turned to her generals. "Prepare the forces. We'll need everything we have." Theron looked uncertain. "But, Your Highness, this is a long shot. We could lose everything." Villara's eyes were filled with resolve. "If we do nothing, we lose everything anyway." And so, with the Xantor closing in on her palace, the princess made her decision. She would put her faith in this young human student and his risky plan. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. The fate of the Voria Empire rested on the courage of a desperate princess and a young human who had just stepped into the storm. The unexpected arrival. As Princess Villara stood before her war room map, trying to steady her nerves, she felt a strange sense of urgency. The weight of her people's future was upon her, and she knew time was running out. The Xantor's forces were closing in fast, and there was no turning back. She had already made the decision to trust Daniel's plan, but the uncertainty of it gnawed at her. Could a student, someone who had never fought in a real battle, truly save them? Before she could dwell on her doubts, a sudden crash of alarms echoed through the palace, cutting through the tension in the room. The ground beneath them trembled as the Xantor began their final assault on the capital. Their warships had entered orbit, and their bombardment was relentless. "We don't have much time," Commander Theron barked, his face pale with fear. Villara straightened her back. "Get everyone ready. We move out immediately. Daniel, come with me." The human student, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, now stepped forward. His heart was racing in his chest, but he didn't show it. The pressure of being part of something this important was immense, but he was determined to see it through. He had no experience in combat, no experience in war, but he knew that this was his chance to make a difference. The two of them, Villara and Daniel, raced down the palace hallways. The echoes of the alarms followed them, and the sound of distant explosions grew louder with each passing second. As they reached the command center, Villara quickly took her place at the central terminal, ordering her forces into position. Daniel stood beside her, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced as he prepared to execute the first step of his plan. "There's one thing we need to do before anything else," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the chaos around them. "We need to disrupt the Xander's communication systems. If we can't stop them from coordinating their attacks, it's all over." Villara nodded. She had already gathered a team of elite soldiers to carry out this mission. It would be dangerous, but it was the only way to have any chance of success. "Prepare the strike team," she commanded. "We hit them hard and fast." Within moments, a group of soldiers clad in advanced armor stood ready. Their faces were stoic, their hands steady despite the looming threat. Villara knew these warriors would give their lives for their people, but there was something different about them this time. They were willing to follow the human student, Daniel, who had just walked into their world. Daniel led them to a small, heavily secured spaceport where a ship was waiting to take them toward the Xander's communication hub. The ship was small and sleek, designed for stealth and quick strikes. It would get them in and out of enemy territory before the Xander could react. As the group boarded the ship, Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. He had never been in a battle, but this felt real. His mind kept racing, constantly running through every detail of the plan. Was it going to work? Was he really ready for this? Villara, standing at the front of the ship, didn't seem worried. Her eyes were calm, focused on the task ahead. She turned to Daniel, her expression serious. "You've got the courage of 1,000 warriors," she said quietly. "Now let's see if your plan can match your bravery." Daniel looked up at her, feeling both honored and terrified. He was just a student after all. What was he doing in the middle of a war like this? But there was no time to question his role now. He had made his choice. The future of the Voria Empire depended on him. With a loud hum, the ship's engines powered up, and they shot out into space, leaving the capital behind. The stars stretched out in front of them, a vast, empty sea of light. It was hard to believe that a few short days ago, this had been a peaceful place. Now, everything was at risk. The ship's course was set for the Xantar's communication center, located on a dark moon just outside the Voria Empire's borders. The Xantar had built a massive facility there, a place where they could coordinate their fleets and direct their military forces. If Daniel's plan was going to work, this was the key. As they approached the moon, the tension in the ship grew palpable. The crew was quiet, focused, every one of them knowing that this mission could be their last. But it was the only hope they had. Once they neared the communications hub, Daniel gave the signal. The soldiers moved quickly, slipping into the shadows of the moon's surface, staying out of sight from any Xantar patrols. Every movement had to be calculated. One mistake could mean the end of their mission. As they infiltrated the enemy compound, Daniel's heart raced. The high-tech sensors of the Xantar were everywhere, and it felt like they were constantly on the verge of being discovered. The soldiers moved with precision, clearing each room, making sure nothing was left to chance. Finally, they reached the control room. It was a large metallic chamber filled with rows of glowing consoles and screens, displaying maps of the galaxy and real-time updates on the Xantar's movements. The soldiers quickly set up explosive charges on the main power grid that controlled the communication systems. They had to destroy the heart of the Xantar's network if they had any hope of disrupting their plans. "Prepare to move," Velara whispered, her voice calm but commanding. "We set the charges, then we leave." But just as they were about to activate the explosives, a Xantar patrol entered the room. They had been discovered. A fight broke out, and the tension escalated. The soldiers fought bravely, but the Xantar were powerful, their weapons cutting through the air like lightning. The blast of energy from their guns illuminated the dark room. It was chaos. The outcome uncertain. Daniel, standing at the edge of the room, watched in disbelief as Velara and her soldiers fought to hold their ground. Would they make it out alive? And more importantly, would their plan succeed? The mission wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the war began, there was a spark of hope in the air. The human student's bold plan. The chaos in the Xantar Communications Center was almost unbearable. Sparks flew from the walls as blaster fire echoed through the metallic chambers. Daniel could hear the soldiers shouting, trying to keep the Xantar at bay, but their numbers were overwhelming. His heart pounded in his chest. He had never been in a real fight before. Everything he had learned in his studies now seemed irrelevant. Nothing had prepared him for this. "Daniel, focus." Velara's voice cut through the chaos, her commanding presence still clear even amidst the firestorm. "The charges, set them now." It was then that Daniel snapped back to reality. This was it. This was the moment. He had to make sure the plan worked, no matter what. He quickly moved toward the console where the explosives had been placed. The soldiers were still fighting fiercely, but time was running out. Daniel's fingers shook as he typed in the code to activate the charges. He felt like the weight of the galaxy rested on his shoulders. One mistake, and it would all be over. With a soft beep, the console flashed green. The charges were set. "Let's go," shouted Velara as she led the way toward the exit. The soldiers followed quickly, but the Xantar were closing in, their blasters cutting through the smoke-filled air. There was no time to waste. Daniel and the others raced toward the escape route, but just as they reached the final door, the worst happened. A blast of energy hit the wall beside them, sending debris flying. Daniel was knocked to the ground, and for a moment, Everything went black. When he came to, he could barely see through the smoke that filled the room. His head was spinning, and his body ached from the impact. He struggled to sit up, wiping the blood from his face. His heart was racing, but there was no time to panic. "Daniel." Valera's voice pierced through the smoke. "Are you all right?" Daniel blinked and looked up, seeing Valera standing over him, offering her hand. He took it, pulling himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, but he pushed forward. "We need to get out of here," Daniel said, his voice shaking. Valera nodded. "The charges will go off in less than 5 minutes. We need to move fast." With the Xantor hot on their trail, they made their way through the underground tunnels of the base. The hallways were narrow, and the sound of the enemy's footsteps echoed louder with every passing moment. They had no choice but to keep moving, hoping the explosions would be enough to disrupt the Xantor's entire communication network. "Everything depends on those charges," Valera said as they hurried along. "If they fail, it's over." Daniel nodded, trying to push aside the fear that was creeping up his spine. There was no guarantee the plan would work, but it was their only chance. The Xantor had become too powerful, and they needed to weaken them in any way they could. If they could take out the communications network, the enemy would be left scrambling, unable to coordinate their attacks. As they reached the final tunnel, they heard the unmistakable hum of Xantor ships in the sky. The enemy was getting closer. The tension in the air was thick, and every second felt like an eternity. "We're almost there," Valera said, her voice steady. "Stay close." But just as they neared the exit, another explosion rocked the compound. The walls trembled, and dust filled the air. Daniel stumbled, nearly losing his balance. His heart pounded as the sound of blasters grew louder, signaling that the Xantor had finally caught up to them. "We don't have time," Valera said urgently. "Go. Now." With one last push, they dashed toward the exit. The door was just ahead, but the Xantor were closing in. The soldiers fought valiantly to hold off the enemy, but there were too many of them. Daniel felt a cold sweat drip down his back. This was the moment. They had to make it out, or all would be lost. The blast went off just as they reached the door. A massive shockwave shook the entire facility, and the ground beneath them quaked violently. Daniel could feel the power of the explosion reverberating through his body. He turned back for a brief moment, watching as the Xantor's control center erupted in flames, their communications grid collapsing in on itself. "We did it," Daniel whispered, his voice full of disbelief. But there was no time to celebrate. The Xantor were still after them, and the explosion had only bought them a small window of escape. They needed to leave the base before reinforcements arrived. With a final burst of energy, Daniel and Valera led the remaining soldiers out into the open, where their ship waited for them. They sprinted toward the vessel, the Xantor's blaster fire narrowly missing them. The soldiers climbed aboard quickly, and Daniel was the last to enter, barely making it inside before the ship's doors sealed shut. The ship's engines roared to life, and they shot off into the sky, leaving the burning Xantor base behind them. Daniel looked out the window, his chest heaving with relief, but his mind was still racing. The mission was only half over. They had completed the first step, but there was no guarantee it would be enough. "We're not out of danger yet," Valera said, as she stood beside him, her eyes focused on the vastness of space outside the window. "But we've struck a serious blow. The Xantor will be scrambling to rebuild their communications. They won't be able to coordinate their attacks for a while." Daniel nodded, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle had only just begun. They had taken the first step toward victory, but many more challenges lay ahead. The war was far from over, and the princess and the human student would need to continue fighting together to have any hope of saving the Voria Empire. The princess's struggle with doubt. The ship sailed through the stars, leaving behind the burning remnants of the Xantor base. The crew was silent, but a sense of cautious relief hung in the air. The mission had been a success, at least for now. The communications grid was down, and the Xantor would be forced to react. But Velara, though outwardly calm, couldn't shake the weight of doubt that had been gnawing at her. She stood at the observation window, her eyes fixed on the infinite stretch of space outside. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let the adrenaline fade and the thoughts creep in. Was it really enough? Could Daniel's plan have actually made a difference? Would the destruction of the Xantor's communication system be enough to turn the tide of the war, or was it just a temporary setback? Behind her, Daniel was seated, checking the ship's systems, preparing for the next step of their journey. He had proven to be resourceful, brave, and quick on his feet, but the weight of the responsibility was starting to take its toll on Velara. She had put her faith in this young human. It wasn't easy for someone like her, someone who had always carried the mantle of leadership with certainty. She was used to making decisions on her own, trusting her instincts and the counsel of her generals. But Daniel had come from another world, from a completely different way of life. How could someone like him have the answer? "Your Highness," came Daniel's voice, breaking through her reverie. He approached her cautiously, as though sensing her inner turmoil. "We've got a clear path for now. We'll need to regroup, but I think we've bought ourselves some time." Velara didn't turn immediately. She just stared out at the stars, thinking. The sight of space had always brought her a sense of peace, but now it seemed empty, too vast, too lonely. There was so much at stake. Her people's survival, her legacy, her father's memory, all of it hung by a fragile thread. "I wonder if it was the right choice," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Velara sighed deeply, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders once more. "I've led my people for years, making decisions that affect millions of lives. I've always been certain of what to do. But now I'm not sure anymore. I trusted your plan, but what if it wasn't enough? What if we just delayed the inevitable?" Daniel looked at her, understanding the depth of her struggle. He had seen it in her eyes earlier, her fierce determination. Yes, but also the burden of responsibility. To be a leader, to make life and death decisions every day, could break even the strongest of hearts. He had never been in a position of such weight, but he could feel the pressure in the air, thick with Velara's doubts. "Sometimes taking a risk is all you can do," Daniel said quietly. "You've led your people with courage for so long. You don't always have all the answers, but that doesn't mean you're wrong to keep fighting. We're still here. That means there's hope." Velara turned to face him now, her expression conflicted. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength he had that surprised her. He was right. There was no certainty in war, no perfect solution. All she had now was the resolve to continue, to fight with everything she had, no matter how uncertain the outcome seemed. "You're right," she said, her voice steady now. "We can't stop now. We have to keep going." Daniel nodded. "We'll face whatever comes next, together." It was strange for Velara to find comfort in the words of a human who had only just arrived in her world. But there was something about him, a quiet confidence, a resilience that reminded her of herself when she was younger. She had to trust him, and in turn, trust herself. The future of her people rested not just on her shoulders, but on the bonds they were forming. Trust, courage, and the willingness to risk it all. As the ship continued its journey through the void of space, the princess knew that this was only the beginning. The Xantor would regroup, and they would strike again. But now, they had a small but important advantage. They had disrupted their enemy's communications, and for the first time in a long while, Velara allowed herself to believe that they could win. But the doubts were still there, hidden deep inside her. They hadn't won yet. The war was far from over. And now, more than ever, the decisions she made would determine not just her fate, but the fate of an entire empire. They had a chance, but the road ahead would be even more treacherous. Velara couldn't afford to falter now, and neither could her people. The next challenge would come soon. And this time, there would be no room for doubt. The execution of the plan. The ship glided silently through the stars, cutting through the vast emptiness of space. Daniel sat at a console, scanning the data as Valera stood beside him. Both of them focused on the mission ahead. The small victory they had won, the destruction of the Xantar's communication hub, had bought them some time, but it had also drawn attention. The Xantar were ruthless, and they wouldn't give up easily. Valera knew that the next move would have to be even bolder. Their next objective was clear: strike at the Xantar supply lines. If they could cut off the resources that fueled the Xantar war machine, it could slow down their advance, giving Valera's empire a chance to regroup and rebuild. But the Xantar had heavily fortified supply depots throughout the galaxy. It was going to be a dangerous mission, one that would require careful planning and quick execution. Valera had gathered her most trusted soldiers, the ones who had survived the battle at the communications hub. These warriors were battle-hardened and loyal, but even they could sense the growing tension. The stakes were higher now. If they failed, the consequences would be devastating. "We need to move quickly," Valera said, her voice steady but firm. "The Xantar will retaliate soon. Our only chance is to take out their supplies before they can reorganize. We have to hit them hard." Daniel nodded from his seat. He had been reviewing the data from the previous mission, trying to find weaknesses in the Xantar's infrastructure. He had noticed something important: an old, abandoned military outpost on the edge of Xantar-controlled space. It was barely used anymore, but it still held valuable resources, including fuel, weapons, and spare parts. If they could take control of the outpost, it could disrupt the Xantar supply chain and give them an edge. He turned to Valera. "I think I've found something. There's an old outpost near here that the Xantar still control. It's a small target, but if we take it, we could cut off one of their main supply lines." Valera's eyes narrowed as she considered his words. "It's risky, but it could work. We'll need to move fast and hit them before they have time to react." The decision was made. They would launch a surprise attack on the outpost, using their ship to drop in quickly, disable the Xantar defenses, and secure the supplies. Daniel would leave the operation on the ground, with Valera and her elite soldiers providing backup. The journey to the outpost took several hours, but it felt like an eternity. Tension hung thick in the air as everyone on board prepared for the operation. The ship's crew made final checks, while the soldiers loaded their weapons and readied their gear. Even Valera, the fearless princess, showed signs of nerves, something she rarely allowed anyone to see. As they neared the outpost, the ship's sensors picked up movement. The Xantar had already noticed them. Valera's heart raced. It wasn't going to be an easy mission after all. "Brace for impact," she ordered. "Prepare to drop in. We need to take control of that outpost now." The ship descended toward the surface of the barren planet where the outpost was located. The ground was rocky, scarred by years of warfare, and the air was thick with the scent of metal and dust. The Xantar had set up defenses, automated turrets, energy barriers, and blast shields, but they hadn't expected an attack so soon. With a sudden jolt, the ship touched down. The soldiers quickly disembarked, weapons raised, moving with purpose. Daniel was the first to lead the charge. He had no formal training in combat, but he had learned quickly. The months spent observing the Vorians had given him insights into their tactics, and now he had to put those lessons into practice. The Xantar were ready for them, but not fast enough. The soldiers moved quickly, using the terrain for cover as they fired at the Xantar defenses. Energy beams shot through the air, lighting up the battlefield in bright flashes. Daniel ducked behind a rocky outcrop, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the automated turrets. "Push forward," Valera shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't let them regroup." The soldiers advanced, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground. Daniel followed closely behind, trying to keep up with the pace of the battle. He had no time to second-guess himself now. The mission was a blur of movement, noise, and blinding flashes. The Xantar fought back fiercely, but they weren't prepared for the Vorians' precision and speed. They reached the main supply depot. The doors were heavily fortified, but Daniel and Valera's team quickly worked to breach them. Daniel's hands were shaking as he set the explosives on the entrance, his mind racing. This was it. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. With a final click, the door exploded open. The soldiers surged forward, clearing the room of any remaining Xantar resistance. They secured the supplies, fuel, weapons, and communications equipment before the Xantar could even attempt to recover. But just as they thought they had succeeded, a powerful rumble shook the ground. The Xantar weren't finished yet. Their reinforcements had arrived. "This isn't over," Valera shouted. "Get to the ship now." The soldiers raced back toward their ship, with Xantar soldiers hot on their heels. Daniel could hear the sound of their heavy footsteps, the air humming with the energy blasts from the enemy's weapons. They were closing in, but the Vorians were faster, more determined. As the ship's hatch closed behind them, Valera's heart pounded in her chest. They had done it. They had struck a blow to the Xantar supply chain. But the battle was far from over. The Xantar would not rest until they had taken back what they had lost. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Valera nodded, her face grim but proud. "For now. But this is just the beginning. We've disrupted them, but we need to keep pushing. The war is far from over." As the ship ascended, leaving the planet behind, the reality of the situation began to sink in. They had completed their mission, but the Xantar would soon retaliate. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The stakes were higher than ever, and Valera knew the road ahead would be filled with even more danger. But she wasn't going to back down now. The fight for the future of her people was just beginning. The climax. A battle for survival. The victory at the Xantar supply depot had given the Voria Empire a small but significant advantage. The Xantar were now reeling, their supply lines disrupted and their forces scattered. But Valera knew this wouldn't last long. The Xantar were relentless, and they would soon regroup to exact their revenge. And this time, they would come harder, faster, and with all the fury of a wounded animal. The ship, still carrying the Vorian team, now sped through space at full throttle. The soldiers were battle-worn, their faces streaked with dirt, their bodies exhausted from the intense operation. Yet even with the physical toll, they were more determined than ever. They had managed to break the Xantar's hold on one of their key resources, but the Xantar weren't the type to simply walk away from their losses. "We need to prepare for the inevitable," Valera said to her team as she stood in the center of the ship's bridge. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a weight that reflected her understanding of the danger ahead. "They will come for us with everything they've got." Daniel, still adjusting to the role he'd been thrust into, sat beside Valera, his fingers gliding over the ship's controls. He could feel the pressure mounting. The battle was no longer just about securing resources or territory. It was about survival. The Xantar would retaliate, and this time, they would be ready for it. "We've got incoming," one of the crew members called out, his voice tense. Valera's expression hardened. She was ready. "Brace yourselves," she commanded. Outside, the stars blurred as their ship made a sharp turn. The Xantar fleet had found them, and the fight for their survival was about to begin. Daniel's heart raced as the ship lurched under the sudden acceleration. The Xantar's ships were closing in fast, their weapon systems powering up for an all-out assault. "I never thought I'd be in the middle of a real battle," Daniel muttered to himself, his hands gripping the seat in front of him. Valera, without taking her eyes off the monitors, gave him a quick glance. "Neither did I. But now we fight to survive." The Xantar ships swarmed around them, their massive warships blotting out the stars as they unleashed volleys of laser fire. The ship shook with every blast, the force of the impact rattling through the hull. The Vorians fought back fiercely, returning fire from the ship's blasters, but the Xantar ships were larger and more heavily armored. "We can't outrun them, Valera. One of the crew shouted over the deafening sound of alarms. "We need a way to take them down." Valera's mind raced. The ship's weapons were powerful, but against the sheer size of the Xantor fleet, they weren't enough. They needed a strategy, something the Xantor wouldn't expect. "Daniel," Valera said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You've been studying the Xantor's technology. What can we use to our advantage?" Daniel glanced at the ship's systems, then back at her. "There's a weakness, something we've seen before. The Xantor's ships rely heavily on their central core for energy. If we can hit the core with a concentrated blast, we could disable their entire fleet." Valera's eyes lit up. "Do it. We'll provide cover." Daniel worked quickly, his hands flying over the ship's control panel. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. One wrong move, and they'd all be dead. But this was their only chance. Locking onto the Xantor fleet's energy core. "Now," Daniel called out. The ship's weapon systems hummed to life as they locked onto the Xantor flagship at the heart of the enemy fleet. Daniel's fingers danced over the controls, adjusting the trajectory and the power levels for the most precise strike possible. Firing in 3, 2, 1. A brilliant burst of energy shot out from the ship, striking the Xantor flagship directly in its core. The explosion was blinding, sending shockwaves through space. The flagship erupted into a massive fireball, taking out several smaller ships in the process. For a moment, there was silence. But the victory was short-lived. The remaining Xantor ships retaliated fiercely, firing back with everything they had. The Vorian ship was rocked by the blast, sending the crew flying against their seats. "We've got damage," someone yelled. "Hull breach on deck 3. Valera's face remained set with determination. "We can't stop now. Push forward." With their ship listing from the damage, they fought through the waves of Xantor fire, targeting smaller vessels and using their speed to outmaneuver the larger enemy ships. Every shot counted now, as the enemy was closing in on their position. The Xantor were relentless, and each moment felt like it could be their last. The battle raged on, but the tide was slowly turning. The Xantor fleet, although vast and powerful, was beginning to lose coordination. Their flagship had been destroyed, and their remaining ships were left vulnerable, unable to regroup effectively. "We're not done yet," Valera said, watching the enemy fleet begin to crumble. "We need to finish this." With a final devastating strike, the Vorians disabled the last of the Xantor ships, sending them spiraling out of control and scattering into the void of space. The Xantor fleet had been broken, its forces in disarray. The battle was won, but at great cost. The Vorian ship was heavily damaged, and their crew was battered. As the smoke and debris from the Xantor's destruction floated in the wake of their victory, Daniel looked around at the crew, each of them still catching their breath from the chaos. It wasn't over. There were more battles to come, but for now, they had survived. "We did it," Daniel whispered, barely believing it himself. Valera nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "This is just the beginning. But today, we fought for our future, and we won." The Voria Empire was still in danger, but they had gained a precious victory. With each battle, their resolve grew stronger, and they now knew they could stand against the mighty Xantor. The fight for survival would continue, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. And it was enough to carry them into the next chapter of their war. The aftermath. A new alliance. The stars outside the ship's windows were peaceful again, their twinkling light a stark contrast to the battle they had just endured. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound as the crew began to assess the damage. The Xantor fleet had been broken, and the Voria Empire had survived. Barely. The damage to their ship was significant, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. More importantly, the Xantor had been dealt a devastating blow. Their morale had been shattered, their flagship destroyed, and their ability to launch coordinated attacks severely hampered. Valera knew this wasn't the end, but it was a victory that would change the course of the war. Valera stood on the bridge, looking out at the galaxy beyond. Her face, usually so composed, now showed the exhaustion and weight of leadership. The battle had been hard, and many lives had been lost. But they had won, and that was what mattered. "Your Highness," one of the crew members said, breaking her moment of contemplation, "we're receiving a transmission from the Xantor." Valera's brow furrowed. What do they want? The crew member hesitated before answering. "It's not from the Xantor forces, Your Highness. It's a message from a human envoy. They're offering an alliance." Valera turned to face Daniel, who had just entered the bridge. The two exchanged a glance, the implications of the message sinking in. An alliance? With humans? Daniel stepped forward. "It must be Earth. They've been monitoring our situation for some time, and this might be their way of offering support." The message from Earth was clear. The human government had been watching the war unfold and had seen the bravery of the Voria Empire in the face of overwhelming odds. They offered to help, not with military force, but with resources, intelligence, and strategic support. Earth had never been involved in galactic conflicts on such a scale, but they were willing to help the Vorians win this war. "I think this could be the turning point we need," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "An alliance with Earth could change everything. Together, we might actually have a chance to defeat the Xantor for good." Valera nodded thoughtfully. "We will need allies, and we cannot win this war alone. If Earth is willing to stand with us, then we must accept their offer." But Valera knew that accepting Earth's help would come with its own set of challenges. Humans were a new force in galactic politics, and many would doubt their strength and influence. Would the Vorians accept them as true allies? Would they trust the humans enough to fight alongside them? As the decision was made, Valera addressed her crew, rallying them with the promise of a new future. "We have taken a great step today, not just for our people, but for the entire galaxy. This alliance will be the foundation of our victory." With the Voria Empire's leadership now secured, and the Xantor dealt a significant blow, Valera knew that her role had only just begun. She would need to guide her people through the hard road ahead, but now they had a chance. A real chance. They had shown their strength in battle, and with Earth's help, they could build a future free of the Xantor's tyranny. Daniel stood beside her, his thoughts a mixture of uncertainty and optimism. He had come to this galaxy as a simple student, but now he was part of something much larger, something that could reshape the future of many worlds. He had played his part in this war, but he was beginning to see that his role had only just begun. "I've never thought I'd be in a position like this," Daniel said, his voice thoughtful. Valera glanced at him, a rare smile playing at the corners of her lips. "None of us expected this, but sometimes destiny finds us in the most unlikely of ways." As the ship continued its journey through space, the crew, though battle-weary, felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had endured the worst of the war and emerged victorious. And now, with the promise of a powerful alliance with Earth, they would face whatever came next with renewed strength. The Voria Empire was not defeated. It was not even close to being finished. They had fought for their survival, and now, with allies by their side, they would fight for their future. The war with the Xantor wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The stars outside the ship were no longer just distant lights. They were the future, one filled with possibility, one that the Voria Empire and their new human allies would shape together. And as Valera looked out at them, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history. It wasn't just about winning the war anymore. It was about building a future, about forming alliances that could last far beyond the battlefields. And for the first time in a long while, Valera allowed herself to believe that it was possible.